Regarding ineligible relatives conceived with my father Kevin Semen. 2020. Hello reconciliation enthusiasts. My indigenous Lingiari, formerly Mussolini, and Webb the Habsburg families here in Gippsland were targeted for abuse, particularly the theft of babies and semen for no valid reason in the early 1900s. My grandmother Myrtle Webb the Habsburg's maiden name was Cook, via unnecessary adoption. Her birth surname was Lingiari. Her father Vincente Lingiari's birth surname was Mussolini. An indigenous Gippsland name. My great-grandfather Vincente was the paternal brother of Benito Mussolini, president of Italy, who was also born in Gippsland. Myrtle married my grandfather James Webb the Habsburg in a registry office on St Kilda Road in late January 1926, when they were both 20. She was pregnant with twins at the time. James became a Duke and Lord of Austria and Hungary when he turned 21 the following year, which made his wife Myrtle a Duchess and Lady. Myrtle was Indigenous Australian Army General Sir John Monash's niece. Sir John was a Mussolini at birth and adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Monash when his father emigrated to Italy with his brother Benito. Duke and Lord James Webb the Habsburg's father was Prince Sebastian Habsburg, only legitimate child of the last legitimate Emperor of Austria and Hungary, Franz Joseph I. My great-grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg was my great-grandfather and predecessor Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollerns' official royal consort in 1943. Duke and Lord James and his wife Duchess and Lady Myrtle were in the Guard of Honour at General Sir John Monash's state funeral along St Kilda Road in 1931. My uncle Ian Webb and my father Kevin Webb were also in the Guard of Honour. My father Kevin was 15 months old at the time. There are several films of the funeral. I will mention here that there is nothing wrong with an Australian, particularly an Indigenous Australian, having a foreign royal title. A species group of tree that was called the warrigal tree was renamed the lemon myrtle after my grandmother. Because the Habsburg monarchy was dissolved as the constitutional monarchy of Austria and Hungary in 1922, leaving only residual equal minor titles, my grandfather Duke and Lord James' children with his wife Duchess and Lady Myrtle were only eligible to inherit a royal Habsburg title when James died. Duchess and Lady Myrtle died in the 1950s. James died in the 1980s in Queensland, years after I saw him at a very large Webb family reunion in Gippsland when I was a child. My father Kevin became a Duke of Austria and a Lord of Hungary when his father James died. The titles passed on to me automatically as his only legitimate child in 2004. My uncle Ian was murdered in the 1970s in Queensland and left everything to my father Kevin and myself. My father Kevin had already divorced my mother Judith before his father Duke and Lord James died. Because she was divorced my father before he became a Duke and Lord of Austria and Hungary, she was not a Duchess or Lady and was therefore ineligible to inherit Austrian and Hungarian Habsburg royal family property and artifacts. They pretended she was still married to my father Kevin when he died in 2004 to attempt to steal money and property off me as sole beneficiary of all his property, non-cash assets, and private belongings. They eventually illegally sold my home property in Yarragon to a man bred with Einstein sperm in Saddam Hussein's mother, who was organized crime show dating the oldest female who used to pretend to be my sister. That female was really granddaughter spawn of evil neo-Nazi Nuremberg trialed Ricky O'Shea, the impostor Herman going after December 1943 to the end of World War II. They illegally sold my family home to someone bred with genocidal pedophile Albert Einstein sperm who was squatting in my house with the granddaughter of a man tried at Nuremberg for torturing my great-grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg and Herman going, a Webb, in Dachau prison in 1944-5. That is the way they illegally try to operate, and the unofficial way they claim they run society is in Australia. I would like to point out here that Oesterreicher's name change in 1913 to a copy of Australia's name with 2 letters removed, Austria, which was a direct reference to intending to stalk Australians in reference to the Austrian-led destruction of around 1.5 million people's homes in Gippsland in 1858, did not mean that anyone who is an Australian citizen is banned from receiving royal Habsburg inheritances. All Prince Sebastian Habsburg's eligible children, all pre-authorized to become dukes, lords, duchesses or ladies of Austria and Hungary when they turned 21, emigrated to Australia prior to 1912 and eventually became Australian citizens. They emigrated before that name changed to Austria. When Duke and Lord James' father Prince Sebastian died in 1960, Austria and Hungary refused to pass on any assets in both counties to Sebastian's children, using the excuse because they became Australians. Several settled in Gippsland, and James married an indigenous Gippsland woman, Duchess and Lady Myrtle. Now, they are pretending they can withhold any royal inheritance, anytime, without reason, to try to illegally hand it over to a spawn of Einstein, or North American circus freaks how rapist-descended Morons. People from the USA still incorrectly claim to be evilly entitled to stalk Habsburgs in an organized crime Truman Show-like format because my homosexual great-great-grandfather Emperor Franz Joseph I was raped by a female from that country and it resulted in an ineligible child. They didn't manage to steal assets or royal title for it and its descendants, so they are still pretending they get to pursue it now. As was usual amongst Gippslanders back to the existence of the 1.2 million plus population city of Yarragon in what is now called Latrobe Valley, she went to the Bayside suburb now known as St Kilda to have all her babies in multiple pregnancies in the small birthing hospitals back from the foreshore. Like literally tens of thousands of others over the years. Those small birthing hospitals looked like 1 or 2 bedroom units and the stock out of the Looney Tunes cartoons. Baby thefts from those birthing hospitals in St Kilda didn't start until after World War I. Prior to then everything was fine. All but one baby was stolen off her at that location every time she had a multiple birth, which was most of her many pregnancies. She was a naturally albino indigenous Gippslander who was separated from her father Vicente due to a stupid discriminatory law that was incorrectly enforced, introduced by what was then the state of Victoria's administration here. It was a ban on part indigenous children who had a foreign, particularly European, parent being allowed to live with their indigenous parent in indigenous communities and reserves in this state. My great-grandfather Vicente Lingiari, not the younger Vincent with AC, handful of sand, guy, had been lobbying with state government on behalf of Gippslanders, walking backwards and forwards to Melbourne to do it, on various issues. His daughter Myrtle was not half European, she had two indigenous parents, but because she was albino she looked light-skin toned, so they confiscated her off her father Vicente, and despite his lobbying would not let her back to live with him, pretending she was half European. She ended up having to use the forced adoption name Cook afterwards. So she was stolen off her parents, how Australian. Not the Canadian-funded version of stolen at birth though, given people from Canada funded the theft of most, if not all, of the babies stolen between WW1 and WW2. People still think running around with a baby stolen at birth or conceived with a stolen sperm, ova, or embryo, to tease the biological parents and maybe steal assets or cash, is what they pass off as a functioning society. Body-functional pantomime society, more like it. Vicente ended up lobbying for her to be returned to live with him and the law being scrapped. Vicente was often mentioned as the type who could run for a state parliament, and his lobbying role was very official. I guess in some ways the motivation for being confiscated and him being rendered unable to walk long distances then move to East Gippsland was to stop him doing it and getting an official position. Then babies were stolen off her to extend that, as a separate motive to other baby thefts from others. Trying to interrupt the past on ancestral history of Gippsland was obviously another motive. Federation into Australia in 1901 stripped Indigenous people of the right to enrol to vote or run for Parliament until 1967. Vulgar and repulsive. There is information that suggests the 5 identical flag designs submitted to the Design the Australian Flag competition after Federation were all designed by former Canadians who were eligible to enter as citizens of Australia. The one that is currently the Australian flag is the simplified version of the competition-winning entries. The use of the Union Jack was officially approved by King Edward VII of Great Britain in 1903. My father Kevin was a triplet and the only one Duchess and Lady Myrtle got to keep from that birth on the 24th of June, 1930. His older brother Ian was a twin born 1926. Ian's stolen twin sister went on to become known as Marilyn Monroe or Norma Jean Baker, my biological auntie. She was one of the stolen children that spawned the whimpering line, maybe your stolen child will end up a famous actor or sports person in a foreign country and get a better life than it would have had with its real parents. A tough one given they all would have been dukes, lords, duchesses and ladies. They still do that these days, but on a much larger scale using stolen sperm and ova. And modern terrorism equipment. At least 2 of my father's male biological siblings ended up astronauts on the Apollo missions and went to the moon, including a same pregnancy sibling. One of my father Kevin's stolen siblings from a previous pregnancy to my father visited him at my family home in Yarragon before I was born. He was captain of St Kilda Saints Football Club's first ever premiership win of many, his name being Darryl Baldock, my biological uncle. The older females who pretended to be my sisters after I was born never really talked about it. But that was indicative of their attitude towards him, then me, after being illegally implanted into my family home for organized crime terrorism stalking reasons by their real parents. Darryl was just another strangely polite man who visited the house who was indigenous and they were not interested. They claim that illegally implanted family routine is good unofficial illegal satellite television these days. Entertainment for thugs. After World War II, a very stupid theme about the looks of babies became an issue in the Gippsland region that was not as obvious as beforehand if it existed at all. It was the ridiculous idea that white or blonde-haired, blue-eyed babies with a few variations were a superior race and the babies more valuable. Absolutely retarded concept and one my great-grandpa Kaiser Adolf I did not agree with, obviously. I want to make it clear that none of the people I mention here are eligible for my imperial family, only me, no arguments. My biological grandmother and her 2 lookalikes. As I mentioned earlier, my mother Judith and her bred lookalikes, then her mother Donna and her bred lookalikes too, were shipped here to Gippsland after my mother was born in January 1940. The main motive was that her father Ioseb, Stalin Djugashvili's father, was an indigenous Gippslander from Traralgon, Bessarionis Djugashvili. My great-grandfather Bessarionis Djugashvili was jailed for life without parole in 1918 for executing the 8 impostors who were pretending to be my Romanov family royals in 1917, after the real Romanov royal family were abducted and murdered in 1916. Check court records of his trial in Russia if you want confirmation of that. He died in jail, a hero to some, in the early 1930s. Donna moved here after she divorced Stalin. One of the crime lunatic's eventual motives for the abduction of my great-grandpa Kaiser Adolf I in December 1943 may have been the fact that Stalin divorced his illegitimate stolen sperm daughter Donna. Ioseb was unaware she was Kaiser Adolf's illegitimate no-consent daughter, but the crime lunatics who knew she was thought their marriage was a perfect trigger to start a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. They bred masses of children using Ioseb's stolen semen after his third wife Donna was involved in stealing it for them so they could put it in storage after their divorce was finalized. Biological uncles and aunties to me are totally ineligible for my imperial family, and so are all their descendants regardless of their family name and other factors, like who else they are related to and what terrorism group they are in. After Donna and her lookalikes arrived in Australia after her divorce, they settled in here in Gippsland, close by my mother Judith. My grandmother, Donna, was told about my family being targeted for no reason and was incorrectly informed that albino children and their immediate descendants increased the likelihood of white-haired or blonde, blue-eyed babies. She was also bred with sperm stolen off the Crown Prince Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern when he was in hospital in 1906 and raised by the terrorism groups involved. My father Kevin was the son of an albino indigenous Gippslander who was a Duchess of Austria and a Lady of Hungary when he was born. The name Gippsland refers to the old city of Yarragon, Yarriallu, Gunnacona area some used to consider what is now Tasmania part of what is now called Gippsland. Before it was called Gippsland. That connection has been gone for a long time. There are more than 100 Gippsland islands, some of them now part of Tasmania. There was a third group in Gippsland who used the southwest area of Gippsland, south of the Sturzeletsky Ranges. They were called the Burinyong and strangely isolated from the other two groups. They announced they were leaving and moving to what is now Tasmania, abandoned where they were living, and left, thousands of years ago. Yarriallu and Gunnacona didn't want where they were living, so it stayed almost abandoned. It is farming land now. It is one of those areas in Gippsland I don't feel any connection to. When I go past it, it just doesn't register in me at all. Tasmanians temporarily took in any babies that were not snapped up after theft between World War I and World War II. They kept the ones they decided they wanted to raise and dumped the rest in foreign countries. Germany ended up with most of them. Germans were ritualistically attacked with mumps infections at puberty to attempt to cause adult infertility at the time, by the millions. They tried to convince the stolen babies they were indigenous Tasmanians before they dumped them there. Instead of indigenous to what is now Victoria, particularly Gippsland. There were a myriad of incidents that completely soured any possible relationship between what is now Gippsland and descendants of Burinyong who moved to Tasmania. Some of them are lunatics who ransack anything they can find of historical value when in Gippsland, as if everything that existed before their ancestors left has to be wiped out and a new start date of the day they were all gone drawn like a line in history. They befriend terrorism groups quite often. The Burinyong emigrated en masse before the sport of native Gippsland, Australian, football was invented in Gippsland in the 1500s. It has nothing to do with them, no matter what they say. They were not involved in the invention of the sport of association football in England either, which was invented by Gippslanders living in England in deep and meaningful conversation with English people and possibly some others at the time. A Tasmanian that was part Gippslander who emigrated to Canada did invent the sport of basketball though. My father Kevin had already been victimized by females when he was younger. He was a responsible man. His attitude towards gender and sexuality was admirable and he had an impeccable attitude towards homosexuals. He had conversations with females and was told quite a few times by those females they were on contraceptive pills when they were not. I would like to point out it did not make him overly trusting. Some were trying to take advantage of a feeling that people needed to repopulate the area. As a result, he had several instances where he had sex with females in his late teens and 20s who said they were on contraception and were not, and never talked to him again afterwards. That resulted in a few older half-siblings he was never told about. Then they moved in on him after being told he was the son of an albino and that could mean white-haired or blonde, blue-eyed babies. So, he met one of my biological grandmother's two lookalikes, who was on fertility drugs but not contraception. She lied and said she was on the pill, as it was called here, and he did not need to worry about it, they had casual sex and she left. 9 months later she had twins, both with, you guessed it, bluish eyes and whitish hair. So, she told the other of my biological grandmother's two lookalikes. Around a year later, she pretended to be the first woman reappearing and said hello to him and did the same thing the other had done. They had casual sex, then she left. When the second one was 6 months pregnant, my biological grandmother, Donna, Kaiser Adolf's illegitimate stolen sperm daughter, and Ioseb Stalin, Chugashvili's ex-wife, moved in on him and pretended to be the first one again. Only this time she made like she wanted to get to know him, date, stay together, hold hands, take walks, have dinner, almost to the point of stalking, but seemingly not quite. To gain his trust she was on contraception for around 3 months whilst taking fertility pills, waiting for the second one's babies to be born. She even moved in with him at the family home he had bought and started paying off when he was about 20 at 27, Campbell Street, Yarragon. It was a little weird and slightly shocking to him. She waited until the other babies were born. At least one, you guessed it, had bluish eyes and whitish hair. So, Donna went off the contraception, on the fertility drugs, and waited. She then had sex with him, hung around long enough to make sure she was pregnant, and then packed her bags and left without telling him why. She had quadruplets. If any of the above number are incorrect then there may be another baby or two, but around 8 total were born, all irrelevant to my royal families and estates, but illegitimate half-siblings nonetheless, that are also either cousins or uncles of aunties. Another by the way. His Imperial Majesty Kaiser Wilhelm Hohenzollern II, my second predecessor, was not Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom of Great Britain's grandson. She was briefly an in-law via a very short marriage that turned out to be a really dull idea. Not biologically related. Queen Victoria was a transgendered homosexual. They both seemed to not know why they decided to try marriage afterwards, as man and wife. Maybe they were just illustrating how stupid homosexuals married to someone of the other gender can look. My father Kevin met my mother Judith. When Donna's daughter, my mother Judith, turned 17 in 1957, they introduced her to him without him knowing who her mother was. In the end, they started casually dating and not much more, as my father was not really all that keen on someone under 18. Then in 1958, after she turned 18, he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. They got married on the 3rd of May, 1958 in Mo, the marriage my great-grandpa Kaiser Adolf I looked up on the records before traveling here in late 1971. He carried her over the threshold, and she moved in with him at 27, Campbell Street, Yarragon. He was working 6 days a week to pay off the enormous house and block. She pretended it was all so romantic, including living together for the first time on wedding night. He did those sort of weird laughs through the whole thing. She was pregnant shortly after, in around June, with their first pregnancy together. When she was sure she was pregnant, she swapped places with a vaguely related identical-looking female and stayed hidden in the local area to see if he said anything. He looked confused, frowned a lot, and my mother's impostor tried to settle into the house, pregnant to someone else, a man called Pedersen, son of neo-Nazi lunatic Ricky O'Shea. O'Shea was tried at Nuremberg after WW2, including for pretending to be her man going after escaping jail in December 1943. In the end, whilst my mother was still nearby, he did not stop and say, "You're not my wife, who are you?" So, her associates who were watching him closely celebrated, and my mother went elsewhere and dumped the babies unregistered at birth, then went away to do whatever she did afterwards like the evil idiot whore she was. The first of the females that ended up pretending to be my sisters was born in March 1959, and they named her after my father's real wife, Judith. Coincidentally, it was the same year my great-grandpa Kaiser Adolf escaped prisoner of war jail in Yugoslavia, later that year in around November. My father started thinking he married a mentally ill woman who may have been having an affair. He was correct, but unaware of the situation in full. My mother's impostor blankly refused sex and insisted on separate beds. My great-grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg died in 1960, after the first illegally implanted child was born. Ironically enough, if my grandfather Duke and Lord James had received his Habsburg inheritance, he could have offered my father Kevin the use of a property in Austria and or Hungary to live in. My mother Judith missed out on becoming a duchess and lady herself when my father Kevin divorced her and won, in the late 1970s. He didn't become a duke and lord until 1984. In January 1961, my mother came back, picked her night, when he'd been drinking, was tired, had been working 6 or 7 days a week, doing overtime, had visitors and jumped him for sex, swapped places again, and the imposter wife who pretended it was back to the usual with separate beds. Judith hid in the local area long enough to make sure she was pregnant and dumped the babies unregistered. Before I was born and survived thanks to my savior, Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern, she had gone elsewhere and dumped around 42 children between 1959 and 1971, all with the same parents as me. I was child 43 when I was born, and the other 2 were unborn when my father spent 5 minutes with me on the 18th of January, 1972 at sunrise, minutes after I had been born. The other 2 were then taken from the hospital whilst my father was at work around lunchtime, stolen from him unregistered, and were 44 and 45, respectively. Of 45 conceived via actual sex. Their mother Judith did not have any children via sex that she gestated herself to anyone other than my father Kevin outside of a marriage between 1958 and her hysterectomy in 1972, which she tried to use to pass herself off as a devout Catholic whore. She dumped them anywhere. Had them in phone boxes, in alleys near orphanages, at the docks close by seafood, etc. They often fell on their heads between her legs and were dumped quickly, thrown to people boarding boats, maybe planes, that sort of thing. She did not exhibit any normal human responses to a baby she gave birth to in her entire life. They were like inanimate objects that were not in her anymore, nothing more. Then she had that hysterectomy later, in 1972, before going AWOL. Several females swapped places pretending to be my mother when my father wasn't home when I was an infant and toddler, only one with what seemed like any sort of a partial decent attitude, and she disappeared, presumed dead. No secret in Europe. When Europe found out I was legitimately made His Imperial Majesty Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollerns heir to the German Imperial Hohenzollern family in February 1972, via an idiot Italian secret service agent with a drinking and gossip problem, and a German States League team, who had only won a handful of titles previously, over 2 slow years. It sort of culminated in tens of thousands of people showing up to the 1974 Soccer World Cup, a tournament Australia Socceroos qualified for the first time ever, and non-mysteriously drew both nations called Germany, and the only team in the competition spelt like the word child, Chile, who yelled abuse and some threats at me during the tournament when the Socceroos were playing, thinking I'd be watching on TV at 2 years old. Like I would have been woken up for it, my eyes propped open, taped up in front of the TV a little too close and forced to watch it by fake mommy. Like Santa's little helper and Mr. Burns. There were some supportive sounding comments apparently, I will say that. A very loud yay, a new Kaiser here and there, apparently. One person, who thinks they are world famous and would demand I mention them, yelled, "Oh, how dare you be the legitimate heir to that homosexual Kaiser Hitler," very loud. People, mainly from teams other than West Germany, said, "Oh come on, you can't say that. We are pretending he was an evil heterosexual who was having it off with Eva Braun. And West Germany won the tournament, so that person thinks they are famous." Both Germanys tried to work out if the Socceroos knew an Australian child, me, had been named Kaiser Adolf I's heir during the 2 matches, and both scored saying, oh, they don't know. Like a Lector movie or something. I assuming it was Austrians and Hungarians who yelled in that strange generic voice of the region, we don't want you to become the new Kaiser because you are Australian. And you could be black. Given my father's father Duke and Lord James didn't get his Austrian and Hungarian inheritance assets when his father Prince Sebastian died in 1960, with the excuse being because he became an Australian, the rest doesn't even take an abacus. Grandfather Duke and Lord James Webb the Habsburg was still alive in 1974, he died in 1984. I will inform those people who stared at the TV cameras and yelled stuff out at me, yet again, that we still did not have TV reception in my hometown of Yarragon at the time. Not that there would have been any guarantees the tournament was on TV. We did get reception shortly after, and as soon as a neighbor got a watchable picture, my father went and bought one to cheer me up for when I got home from a hospital stay. I was plonked in front of it after getting home from hospital one day, after being attacked and hospitalized whilst my father was not home, again, and saw some early televomit fiction. It is a lot worse now. There is a lot more of it and it is on specialist channels on rotation, and they just rework the same material over and over every couple of months like a full-time job, turned industry. Since I was born and named Kaiser Adolf's sole legitimate successor, the fictional vomit about him on TV has gotten worse over the years. If they pretended he killed 1 million Jews and homosexuals during World War I before I was born, it became anywhere from 6 to 20 million in the years after I was born, if you understand me. Exaggeration after I was born also came with modern techno performance exaggerating drugs to cheat sport with, by the way. I watched 48 seconds of a documentary a few years ago where the footage had been computer altered to make Kaiser Adolf look like he was impersonating illegal footage of my dad Kevin sitting on the couch talking to me at home. They pretended he was impersonating my father Kevin rubbing his chin, with Adolf saying he's thinking, millimeter, there she is over there. I might marry her and wait for the first homosexual short-statured one to get born, dump the rest unregistered, and make that the new Kaiser of Germany for him, with real mouth movements to suggest that. Fake audio underneath the voiceover too. My father Kevin was 14 when Kaiser Adolf was abducted, my mother was 4. They hadn't met yet. But they were both in Gippsland after 1942. The description of the documentary on the pay TV program information strip said my great-grandpa ate opiates, tranquilizers, bull semen, Hungarian peasant feces, and testosterone every day as a health regime. Like milkshakes or something. Curly straw. I thought he must have had it off with a Hungarian man for a while when he was Prince Imperial then, yeah. Which he did, they had private dinners, table for 2 away from the other guests. Pheasant with orange glaze and nasturtium flowers was one of Adolf's favorites. Then Prince Imperial Adolf was dating a Hungarian man when he was royal visited by his auntie Wallis Simpson, the new Duchess of Cambridge, and her husband Duke Edward in 1938. The former monarch of Great Britain. The trip went bizarrely well despite the interference, apparently. Then there was footage of someone taking home movies of my great-grandpa. It looked like it was a younger gay man who had the camera, and Kaiser Adolf looked and thought, should you be? As if shocked about the guy having the camera in his hand or something. So, they voiced it over and said it was home movies taken by Eva Braun, and I had to switch it off. He never actually met Janet at all. 48 seconds was all I could manage, and I was surprised I lasted that long, really. There is regularly worse televomit, particularly on the internet. Must be embarrassing for the people who make it and then rehash it who are not mental patients by now. Footage of Prince Imperial and new Chancellor Adolf Hitler making his first speech in Parliament after unexpectedly being elected Chancellor had been altered to make it appear, with subliminal sledgehammer fake audio superimposed under, but like it was a personal, have a few beers and try other gender sex ad, just for me, as a personal pre-recorded magic future prediction message from my great-grandpa. Cousins. To complicate matters, my homosexual uncle Ian Webb Semen was stolen in the 1940s when he was a teenager. He was the son of an albino and had whitish hair and very sparkly light grey, silver, diamond eyes. There are literally thousands of cousins conceived with that semen, around 3,000. For various motives, usually look-alike breeding campaigns for future possible organized crime purposes, or lunatic native food motives, even recipes apparently. Backups in case someone cannot be pushed out of the light. They used it to try to breed lookalikes for the baby stolen off my father before birth, and my 2 younger ineligible unregistered triplet siblings, obviously. Just in case they needed replacing with a lookalike, and vice versa, if they gave one of them a shove to try to push them out of the light as well, or the partial shade, and they refused to lurch forward into the dark crime like a pantomime actor doing a pratfall. They bred masses of them, sorted them out into bunches who look alike, and sometimes tried to group a biological sibling of mine conceived via sex between my married parents into each lookalike bunch, obviously. If the sibling or one of the others that has a public-looking profile won't play loon, they just swap them over if possible, and if that doesn't work, they just re-record everything using a related one who looks similar, and replace the material for release or broadcast with it. It gets worse, or more complicated though, as far as biological siblings go. The Embryo K. After I was named Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollerns royal heir in 1972, then sole beneficiary of his Italian estate in 1973, and it became clear it was for real, they decided to approach my mother and check her out. I do not mean at home either, her impostor was still pretending to be my father Kevin's wife full-time. She had a hysterectomy later in 1972 and had no means to gestate a baby. But they decided to examine her anyway and discovered she still had functioning ovaries and was still producing ova. She was, at that time, not anywhere near aware of my imperial status. They had a chat with her and made her an offer. They would put her on fertility drugs, put a zip in her torso to access her ovaries, and if she came in once a month to have her ova collected, they would give her free accommodation and seafood for life. And she agreed. After they got divorced, my father started seeing a female in a local town called Druin. She had no means to gestate a child after a hysterectomy either. He went to visit her without telling anybody, including me, which was fine by me, on his days off, except Sundays. People thought he was working 6 days a week, working his rostered days off, working during his annual and long service leave. Even joked about it disrespectfully. On his days off he used to get up, prepare like he was going to work, catch the train towards where he worked anyway, and go and visit her instead. None of my business obviously, he was not bringing her home for dinner or anything. Then the usual happened and she stole his semen, and it was put in storage. They used it to fertilize the ova they harvested off my mother to create embryos, like it was an organized crime make-work project, with some vague intentions of trying to steal my imperial family off me, amongst other motives. Like Italy. This is the sort of thing lunatics do as a make-work project. Most likely they were just trying to breed lookalikes to use to swap places with each other. The best they can do now is claiming they have a 4-way surrogacy agreement, as if an imperial one, between my mother Judith, my father Kevin, Kaiser Adolf I and a female to gestate the baby, signed and authorized before he abdicated to me on the 28th of December, 1977. That is for an embryo baby gestated in a third party and born after my great-grandpa died, which is not possible under the rules. Even though both my mother and father were ineligible to get involved in an imperial parenting agreement, as neither were German imperial family and one biological parent must be. Ridiculous. They cannot have copied one written and authorized for me to be born, because there was not one. Kaiser Adolf I had never contacted my parents to discuss them having a baby for him before I was born. Which he didn't have to do. If there are documents, they are obviously fake. Most of the females who gestated the embryos without consent from my father or mother just happened to be representatives of organized crime or terrorism organizations who just happened to have been trying to steal money, property, etc. off me, in some cases for decades, 40 years or more in some instances. Like Vincent Corleone's sister, for example. No chance of any of them ever getting into my imperial family. It is a ridiculous concept. I do not tolerate people pretending that one of them, who they claim has public fame on its side, will be taking over my imperial family if something happens to me, by pretending my mother approached my father and said, I still have functioning ovaries, let's have some children gestated in a third party, so Kaiser Adolf has a backup to Crown Prince Brian Webb, and contact Adolf in Italy for some documents. There is only one set of documents and they are for me, and he could not use the rule to name another biological great-grandchild, and he died when I was 10. Pretending biological siblings born after he died could be eligible as backups is ridiculous fiction. If they have documents, they are fake and there is some potentially serious jail time. And most of the around 1,000, apparently, just happen to have been gestated in organized crime and terrorist types, including match-fixing trash. Really? No offense to the decent human beings amongst the biological siblings. My father Kevin and my mother Judith divorced in the late 1970s. They had no other biological children in their joint custody before or after I was born. I was the only biological child of my parents. I was still the cause of child maintenance support payments ordered by the divorce court order from my father Kevin to his ex-wife Judith, until I turned 16 in 1988. If there were any younger siblings registered to them both who went home in their joint custody, a sharing thing, I would have noticed. So would the courts at the divorce hearing. And they would not be eligible anyway. It would also have been seriously amazing since Judith had a hysterectomy shortly after I was born. I'll spare everyone that stop at perfection joke. F off. By the way, as of February 2020, there are no embryos or sperm left from my stolen semen either. If someone did manage to fake a child conceived with the last of my stolen semen without consent being registered to me at birth and born with consent, like with a fake imperial parenting agreement, it would be too late to make it my own now anyway. The last one was born around 2 years before I wrote this, and the time limit after a birth to authorize a new eligible baby is 18 months. I do not have the means to authorize those sorts of documents anyway, as I have never designed and registered what is required. There's little chance of me trying to design and register what I need to officially to authorize imperial family documents without access to my money and property first. Come on people, I am the sensible one here. Kaiser Adolf's imperial seal dimatrix became invalid the day he died in 1982 and there has not been a new one since.